and deciding, boy, I'm going to throw myself into my studies even more. I think I'm going to go to medical school. The drug companies gave us samples of pain medicine. I was overworking, not sleeping enough, driven. And if the medication would allow me a way to cope with all that, and I thought it did, then I could sample it. I will say that the reps told us that if patients, regardless of the form of opiate, if the patient had a legitimate pain, there was no way they could become addicted. And I thought I was invulnerable. I thought I could sample the samples. Also, that I could do that and no one would be aware of it, that it could be a secret. And the realtor had scheduled a showing, but I was so dope sick I couldn't get out of bed. And he said, well, they look like they've got you on prescription fraud. They look like your medical records are really sloppy. You could be talking about a felony and incarceration. And I thought, what? How did this happen?
Have you ever heard of the expression dope sick? Dope sick is a phrase commonly used to describe the physical, psychological, and emotional withdrawals associated with trying to quit drugs, or more specifically, opioids. Symptoms include fever, chills, extreme sweating, fatigue, nausea, and vomiting. Most would associate being dope sick with being a drug addict, but not a professional, not an educated person, and certainly not a family doctor. But our enemy, the devil, is a master deceiver, and sometimes he can bring addiction under the guise of pain relief and treatment. Sometimes he can deceive the person who is supposed to be administering these things legitimately and pull him into addiction also. And therein lies the biggest deceit of all, that anyone could be above temptation. How does a doctor become addicted to the very medicine he is administering? What happens when that doctor is caught? Is there healing for that person? And if so, what does that look like? These are questions that I want to discuss with our guest today as he tells us his life change story. I'm Eric Hutchinson, and this is the If Nothing Changes podcast. So, hey, new friend, why don't you introduce yourself and tell the listeners who you are?
I'm Lou. I'm a grateful believer in Jesus Christ, and I celebrate recovery. From being a physician who got addicted to seeing patients and addicted to opiates, I continue to struggle with PTSD and grief.
So every story has a beginning. So why don't we start with your beginning? Where were you born and where were you raised?
I was born and raised in the Maryland suburbs of Washington, D.C. It was just 3 miles from the D.C. line.
So I visited Washington, D.C. when I was in high school with my dad, and we went to the Capitol, went to the Washington Monument, and we went to the Smithsonian. Of course, we only got to see part of that, but it was a lot of fun. So anyway, that's neat that you kind of grew up in that area. What was it like in your family? Did you have any siblings, or are you the only child?
I had an exceedingly privileged childhood. I was an only child. My parents were older. They'd suffered some miscarriages before me and after me. And while I was very privileged and they doted on me, the side effect of all that, I guess, was that I believed that I was the center of the universe. So it made me, I guess, in my core, pretty selfish, always thinking about myself first.
So was there any faith in your family? Did your parents go to church? Did they raise you to believe in God?
Yes, raised Roman Catholic. There was no doubt in my mind that God existed, that I was his child. And apart from that, however, and I was reverent without a doubt there also, and followed the rules of church with the sacraments that one would receive as a Roman Catholic up until the time I was a teenager. But I would say that while I believed in God and had reverence for him, he was not in the equation of my life. I did not try to figure out what God's will and plan was for me, saying simply, he wasn't in the equation of any of the decisions that I made.
So do you think that were you confident in yourself? I mean, what was going on in the inside of Lou? What was your identity growing up there in your elementary to middle school years? Were you confident in yourself? Did you believe anything different about yourself than what was shown on the outside?
I probably developed a lot of anxiety in later elementary school. I remember fifth and sixth grade, that confidence that I had waning, and also the realization that I had to work really hard to succeed and achieve in school, and that there was a lot of pressure on me, a lot of expectation. Yeah, I probably imposed it myself, but maybe my parents imposed some of that on me. My dad would say, "Apply yourself, and you can get ahead." Well, that created a bit of a conflict there. But how hard did I have to apply myself? And
Did you believe that performance was what defined you? If you did things well, that you were a good boy, and if you didn't, you were a bad boy?
without a doubt, and I see that in both of my parents. My dad was an Italian American immigrant family. His grandparents came from uh, Italy, and their goal was achievement, the American dream. And my mother was kind of like a poor hillbilly from Western Maryland, which is like West Virginia, and they had gone to the big city from their small towns, and that was achievement based. So I inherited that tendency, that perception.
So let's move to your senior year in high school. So did you have aspirations of going to college because of you said you were very academic and like school. So did you get a scholarship? What was the decision to go to college or go into the workforce? Tell me a little bit about that.
College was an expectation. There was no question. It was an expectation imposed from my parents, and I readily accepted that expectation. I wanted to go to college. I wanted to go to a good college. This town that I grew up in was where the University of Maryland, College Park, the large University of Maryland campus was, and they had 35,000 students there. Um, I attended some protest rallies there, but I saw that the school was too big, and maybe my parents perceived that also. I would get lost in that large campus. So I sought out a small private school, looked at a bunch of them my junior year, interviewed with a bunch, got a little scholarship to Gettysburg College, and that's where I went. Was not sure at all. I really liked journalism. I had a large role in our school newspaper. So I went off to college with the idea that I was going to study journalism in some fashion.
So if I could hit the pause button for just a moment and say, what was the biggest struggle in your life up to that point? So you're freshman in college, but you're looking back over your, childhood years, your adolescence. What would you say your biggest struggle was?
It was somewhere between dealing with my inherent anxiety, but also fitting in with a bunch of friends, and feeling like the over anxiety was pretty strong, overwhelming at times, and and needing to fit in with friends, whatever that looked like.
So as you moved into college and you're kind of on your own a little bit, did you continue to just throw yourself at your studies and all of that, or did you get a little bit more social?
Very little more social. Mostly threw myself into my studies. Worked really hard. I even in high school, I realized that I wanted to achieve, and I studied a lot. It was a lot of hours of work and evenings, and then college was the same thing. I mean, one of my friends called me a grinder. I would continually grind from early in the morning till late at night, find secluded places on campus to study where there were no one else around. I could concentrate, and so a lot of time spent every day pursuing studies.
So would you say that your struggle with anxiety and, a little bit of the performance thing that all just carried over into college? Did you have any additional struggles in college that you didn't have in high school?
No, just the idea. I felt like if I did the best I could, if I applied myself fully, if I worked every minute that I could, essentially, then I would achieve, and that's all that I could expect of myself, and that would be a way to quell anxiety. Working hard, keeping moving, was a way of quelling anxiety.
So would you classify yourself, at least at that time period, a workaholic or not?
Yes, without a doubt, I was. Although I really didn't fully understand it at the time, as I do now, looking back. But yeah, I was a workaholic. Am a workaholic still yet to an extent.
So, did you have a clear picture? I know that you became a medical doctor, and I know I'm giving away a little bit of your story, but did you have a clear path in college that that's what you wanted to do?
I've discovered that people like to do what they do well. And I found in my freshman year of college, I did well in biology. And so I continued that, changed from journalism to be declaring biology as a major. And then my father died suddenly of a heart attack. A lot of unfinished business there, a lot of adolescent struggle continuing. And so with doing well in a biology major and having lost my dad, realizing that there was more, I felt there was more pressure on me without his help and counsel and support. I really threw myself into studies. And it was that point I can remember exactly where I was driving on the interstate to go back to the family farm to see him, or the emergency room nearby where he died. And deciding, boy, I'm going to throw myself in my studies even more. I think I'm going to go to medical school. He was a PhD, but he felt like he was not a real doctor. And I remember at one point he said, we have the assets, showed me the US savings bonds that he had squirreled away in the drawer of his desk. If you want to be a real doctor, we can do that for you. And somehow, in some unconscious fashion, now looking back, I assume that as a charge from him. And so within his death, I jumped at that opportunity. And then I became even more of a workaholic.
Wow. Did you, would you say that after your dad passed away, that you grieved in a proper manner, or did you just avoid grieving through your work?
Avoided grieving through my work. Did not know what grief was all about. Really didn't, although I guess I tried. It still was uncharted territory for me. And so I just threw myself more heavily into work.
So where did you do your residency? Did you stay in the same location, or did you move away? How did that go?
So I went to the University of Gettysburg College, then the University of Maryland School of Medicine, which was in downtown Baltimore. But having this affection for West Virginia, I was able to do a residency in West Virginia. Of the first opportunity to get out of the DC suburbs, the Baltimore suburbs, and move to West Virginia was something I jumped at. Found a nice community hospital in Clarksburg, West Virginia, where I am now, that had a residency in family practice. And for a family doctor, it seemed ideal because I doctored multiple generations, from great grandma to the great grandchildren, and knew all those family interconnections. And really, that was important in family practice, to know your patients deeply and know all those interconnections. So it worked out real well.
So did you have any time for dating and developing relationships that way? Did you end up getting married during that time period, or tell me a little bit about that?
Dated in medical school a little bit, and then quickly found a nurse that I thought we fit together well, and we got married in my second year of medical school. And then we moved to West Virginia to start a family. And had actually three children out here. That marriage suffered. I think about it like this. I didn't know anything about the five love languages. Her love language was quality time, and my love language was words of affirmation. I was never home. She never got any quality time. I was always focused on patients and the phone and the beeper. And she never felt loved, and she never said much, I love you. So I didn't hear words of affirmation. That marriage was fated for disaster, which it did fall into.
So would you say that some of that anxiety and that workaholism came into your marriage and caused the problem?
Oh, without a doubt, that was there, and unresolved grief, not being able to really come to grips with my feelings and deal with them, bearing feelings, bury it was the style.
It doesn't sound like there was any kind of abuse during that time period. It sounded to me like that work was your God with a little g, and that you were heavily into that. Am I missing something, or is that an accurate picture?
No, no abuse. My A score is zero. A score is zero without a doubt. And so I've always wondered how it is that I got into the addiction that I did, and it was some level of trauma, not related to the adverse childhood experience kind of trauma. And that's what I've actually been dealing with the last 6 months or so in some kind of trauma therapy. That's a whole other story. But I realized that I've been dealing, and the loss of my father was trauma, certainly. So all those things play a role in producing the workaholic addict that I am.
So give me a little bit of the events that led up to you getting into your addiction. How long had you already had your 3 kids? Were you divorced yet? I mean, how long were you in the medical field before that became an issue?
No, it was relatively early on, and I was a rule follower, except I had access to all this prescription pain medicine and some tranquilizers, and I thought I was invulnerable. I thought the rules didn't apply to me in that area. So if there was an area that I was going to violate rules, it was I thought I could sample the samples, and also that I could um, do that and no one would be aware of it. That it could be a secret, and that I wouldn't get in any kind of trouble because of that. But indeed, I did. The drug companies gave us samples of pain medicine. I was overworking, not sleeping enough, driven. And if the medication would allow me a way to cope with all that, and I thought it did, then I could sample it. And of course, that gets way out of control very quickly.
So I saw a show on Hulu. My wife and I watched a show called Dope Sick, I think it was called, and I think Michael Keaton was the main character there. I don't know if you saw that or not, but would you say that that was a similar type thing that happened to you, where you were being approached by these big pharma companies and they were promoting their drug, and it's all about pain? And so what made you start sampling that? Did you have some physical pain that you were trying to medicate and it just worked its way into addiction, or did you say, hey, I think I'm going to give this a shot?
I had a lot of tension headaches, a lot of headaches, neck pain, all from tension, not a physical injury. Um, and if I could get relief from a headache with a pain pill, if I could get relief of my anxiety with a pain pill, if I could, at the end of a working 12 hours in the office, feeling worn out, and I could take a hydrocodone, which would give me energy and euphoria, take away any pain that I had, and relieve any anxiety. As I said, 10 feet tall and bulletproof. My first hydrocodone made me feel that way. And I was absolutely invincible. Leap tall buildings in a single bound, faster than a locomotive, all that sort of stuff. In fact, I was interviewed by a group from Sweden, a Swedish newspaper, about my story. And I said, I'm 10 feet tall and bulletproof. He said, you mean 3 meters? I said, yeah, you got it. But anyway, that was funny. And indeed, that Dope Sick book and the Dope Sick movie with Michael Keaton, who is a local Pittsburgh, we're near to Pittsburgh, he's a Pittsburgh hero, uh, was very much like my story. We were happily practicing medicine without a lot of pain medicine, but very quickly it was the patient's rights to have their pain controlled. You need to do what you need to do, doctor, to control patient's pain. You need to ask about it. It may became the fifth vital sign: temperature, pulse, blood pressure, respiration. And now you're asking their pain level and marking on a scale of 1 to 10. And then, doctor, your patients have this right to be, and you need, as a good doctor, to address this problem. And all of a sudden, um, there were samples on my desk. There were samples in the sample closet. Please try this. And then, pharmaceutical repping started with 5 older guys who were esteemed members of the community, older men, and I would see one's patient rep, one pharmaceutical rep a day, maybe. Then, then it was 20 a day. Then it was all kinds of younger reps, women reps, and then co-marketers. So you would see three reps from three different companies marketing the same drug. And it just became, how can I possibly, and I'm basically struggling with codependency, wanting to make people happy, like to make these pharmaceutical reps happy by seeing them, hearing their story. And they did provide very valuable medical information. It was impossible to keep up with all the developments in medicine. And there were all these new things, new drugs, new treatments, and they made life better for patients. At least it appeared that way. And why wouldn't I want my patients to have all the benefit that they could? So I became known as an early adopter of new practices and new medications. I was a thought leader in the community. If Dr. Atenzio does it, it's probably a good thing. You should do it too, doctor, the pharmaceutical rep would say. And so I was sought out by more and more reps. And it looked like a wonderful thing until it wasn't. We continually promoted more and more potent opiates out there. Hydrocodone was the introduction of it. Then oxycodone came out in a short acting form, Percocet. But then the main thing was Oxycontin, which was a sustained release. You would take one pill and it would release its medication in your bloodstream over 12 hours, as opposed to immediate release. And then it just went on from there. I will say that the reps told us that if patients, regardless of the form of opiate, if the patient had a legitimate pain, there was no way they could become addicted. There was also the belief that then, and we were told that OxyContin was not addictive because of its steady state drug level, its slow release. They were told, and there was no evidence for this, that the highs and lows is what causes the addiction. It's not the highs and lows. It's the mere presence of that codeine or opiate in the bloodstream, in the brain, that causes a problem. We had I had no training in addiction medicine. It just didn't happen. Most of the addiction medicine stuff that I learned was from popular media and the 12 steps. So we were ill-equipped. We were told a lot of good things. The pharmaceutical industry, big pharma, has produced a lot of really remarkable medicines that have changed the course of lives and made life better for people. But they were off the mark with this one. And did not recognize that some 14 to 17% of people can become addicted to these agents.
So you're starting to sample some of these, and
yes,
you are still married.
Yes.
Okay, so you're still married, and maybe you've got a kid or two or three. This comes along, and so. At what point, or did at any point, did your wife or kids did they ever take note of? Was there any change in your behavior, or was this completely secret?
I tried to keep it as secret as possible, and I think there was some degree of secrecy until I had finally admitted the problem that I had. But it took a whole bunch of terrible events before I could admit that to myself and to others. The hitting bottom was two different times. I was never home. I never heard words of affirmation. Our marriage was falling apart, and we were divorcing. And in the course of the divorce, we were selling one of our houses. I actually made a lot of money as a doctor. It's almost hundreds of thousands of dollars every year as a doctor because I worked really hard. And I saw a lot of patients and sent the bills in, and it can be a very lucrative profession. So we had multiple homes, but I was living at a lake house, and in the course of the divorce, we were going to sell this house, and the realtor had scheduled a showing, but I was so dope sick I couldn't get out of bed. The realtor had called saying, please, make your exit. We're going to bring a family through. But I was too sick to get up. So I just was laying in bed, and I could hear the family coming in, talking with the realtor. I covered myself up with blankets in the bed, and I could hear their lively talking cease with the realization that there was a body lying in that bed. I don't know. That was terribly embarrassing. And then the other bottom hitting episode was having my office staff that I loved and appreciated so much have an intervention with me, telling me that unless I got it together, they couldn't work for me any longer. Um, those were the two main hitting bottom events.
So we talk about hitting bottom at Celebrate Recovery all the time and what those are. You mentioned two different events, and I'm assuming that those happened within short periods of time from each other. And so where did that lead you? I mean, so you have to, we always say step one, realize that I'm not God. I admit that I'm powerless to control my tendency to do the wrong thing. And so you're getting high, or you're taking this stuff, you're medicating, and maybe you're medicating some for maybe your divorce. Or from what you're going through, the pain of that. I've been through divorce. It's one of the most painful things I've ever been through. And so I can imagine that maybe, all of that added to you continuing to take that. But describe to me where the turning point was. So were those two events the turning point, or did you continue down that path a little bit?
I began to talk with the nurse, another nurse at the hospital, and she showed me great compassion. I knew she was a Christian. I told her a little bit of the struggles that I was in, and the next time I saw her a week later, she said, "I prayed for you in church." And I thought, what is this? You prayed for me? She shared with me the good news of Jesus Christ, and I accepted Christ on my knees in one of my exam rooms. And within months, I was delivered from my addiction with her help and with God's help, certainly. And I understood salvation at that point. I knew that I'd screwed up big. I really messed things up, and I needed forgiveness. I didn't understand how you got forgiveness, but she was able, Donetta, my wife now, was able to tell me that if I just asked for forgiveness from God, he would give it to me. And so I was able to turn things around at that point, and was able to get sober. Never went to treatment, never went to detox, was delivered from the addiction issues. But still, a lot of things happened after that. 4 months into my sobriety, Donette and I got married. Um, Things were hunky dory, as they say, for a month until the feds raided my office.
Wow.
In addition to prescribing to myself, I wrote fraudulent prescriptions. When samples ran out, I began to write fraudulent prescriptions, but I also prescribed a whole heck of a lot of controlled substances to a whole lot of patients. Again, I thought I was in compliance with the rules of pain medication prescribing and all those things, but I did contribute to patient overdose and deaths. That was another bottom hitting thing, realizing that had happened. Um, so the feds saw their fraudulent prescriptions and all those awful things that had happened, and they raided my office. Um, and 2.5 years later, I was convicted of federal felonies.
So I want to hear about the day that the feds raided your office. That must have been a shocking shock and awe. Were you at the office when they came in, or did you just show up and they were already there? Tell me a little bit about that day.
My office staff called me early in the morning that the feds had gone in the door. They were there, and I showed up later. Actually, after they'd left, they did a raid, questioned the staff, inspected the office, and it was just horrific. I remember several days later talking to my attorney and asking him, "What does this mean?" And he said, "Well, they look like they've got you on prescription fraud. They look like your medical records are really sloppy. You could be talking about a felony and incarceration." And I thought, what? How did this happen? So that was a real shocker. But I was sober at that point. I was clear um, in my thinking, and God was with me. I figured somehow we'll get through it. But I was, talking about trauma, that was trauma too. We'll say another thing that happened a month after we got married, the feds raided my office. 6 months after that, again, 7 months after getting married, I developed necrotizing hemorrhagic pancreatitis. I had a gallstone lodged in my pancreas. Uh, I was having internal bleeding. I ended up in a coma, on a ventilator, on life support. for 2 weeks, in the hospital for a total of 7 weeks, and I was temporarily disabled. This was just another disaster. Gosh, yeah. I woke up, I was really fuzzy in that last day before I went to the hospital. I knew I had a bellyache, didn't know what was going on. I remember just going to the emergency room and surrendering. You got to do whatever you can do. But I remember waking up 2 weeks later when they brought me off the ventilator, and I began to realize that I'd almost died. I could still yet die. This pancreatitis was really bad, and I had a very complicated course of pancreatitis. It's a miracle that I lived. In fact, the doctors, they were my friends and my colleagues, told Donetta that I was going to die. They just prepare for my death. The numbers, my clinical numbers were terrible. The life support that I was requiring was extreme. It just didn't look like any way. But she prayed. A whole bunch of people prayed. I was on prayer list. Got anointed for healing in proxy and in person, and things turned around. So, and that's in the midst of all this federal investigation stuff. All this was going on. So I emerged from my coma. I got being and get healthy again, and then 2.5 years from the time of the raid on the office, I pleaded guilty to prescription fraud and insurance fraud, and my medical license was revoked.
So let me ask you this question, because I know that you're heavily involved in Celebrate Recovery. What led you into Celebrate Recovery, or was that a part of your recovery? Tell me a little bit how you got into Celebrate Recovery.
So I lost my medical license. I got involved in a bunch of minimum wage jobs. I no longer had a medical license. I mean, I'd gone from high school to college to medical school to residency to practice. So with no medical license, I went to Manpower, got a job cutting grass on the golf course as a greenskeeper, delivered pizza at night. Um, it was what I had to do because my income was drastically different. So after 5 years of sobriety, after having worked these other jobs, I got the job as a director of a homeless shelter recovery center in our town. A big part of our ministry was Celebrate Recovery. And I didn't want to go to any meeting where I had to say, hi, I'm an addict, because I was no longer a drug addict. I just didn't know what my struggles were. But I figured if the residents, the folks that we were caring for, were going to CR, I would go check it out. And within the first month, it came on, the light went on, because of my onion peels through step study. My onion peels with it's a chemical addiction. Deeper to that is codependency, people pleasing. Deeper to that is anxiety. At heart of all, I'm just plain selfish. That's kind of how my onion peels. Now there's grief and PTSD and that sort of stuff in there too. But that's kind of how, I was no longer an addict, but I was still being very codependent in my handling of ministry. And so again, within the first month of this new job in ministry, I got engaged in CR in a really big way. My life verse is Ephesians 3:20, that God is able to do exceedingly abundantly more than we can think, ask, or imagine by his Holy Spirit power. And that because I've seen God into my life in all kinds of ways and do things in my life that I would never have imagined, giving me opportunities that I could never have even dreamed of in all this. I mean, from the struggling, anxious teenager to a workaholic, high school, college, medical school, to a practitioner who fell uh, dramatically, an esteemed member of the community. I was our Harrison County Chamber of Commerce Citizen of the Year. I founded our free medical clinic in town, and years later, here I am, a federal felon, defrocked, losing his license. And God now has restored me to being an influential member of the community, may I humbly say, having an impact on those with substance use disorder, and helping the community understand that there is hope and giving God the glory for all that. I mean, it's exceedingly abundantly more than I could ever have thought, asked, or imagined. And God did it. I didn't do anything but surrender. All I was, a doctor who got screwed up, but knew that the solution of the problem is Jesus Christ. Could never have imagined all this, never could ask for it, exceedingly abundantly more.
Amen. It's in our weakness that God is made strong.
Right, and that's the case. That doesn't make any sense in the natural. It's nothing that I would ever. I remember looking at the 12 steps back when I was beginning to struggle, way before the big problems happened. And I said, they talk about being powerless and being life is unmanageable. Well, I don't want to be powerless. I want more power. I certainly don't want things to be unmanageable. I'm going to manage these things. So I did not understand the 12 steps until I understood the 12 steps. Certainly step one. It's been remarkably good since then.
So let me ask you this question. As you are entering an elevator with someone and they say, hey, what's your life all about? You got 60 seconds to tell someone one message. What would that message be?
I was a fellow who felt like God was there but did not rely on him. When I finally relied on God, he directed my steps. I followed his plan and will, and it gave God glory. But God's able to do more than you can even think, ask, or imagine and when you surrender to him. And that's my story. I surrendered and God took control. There's great hope. The narrative is hopelessness, but that's not the truth. The truth is a narrative of hope in Jesus Christ.
Lou, thanks so much for sharing your story with us today. Hey, if you are listening and the enemy has lied to you, deceived you, and taken you down a dark path, maybe it's been a long con. Bit by bit, you have fallen into that belief that you are above temptation. No one is above temptation, and everyone has hurts, habits, and hang-ups. The question is, do you want change in your life? God can bring that change, but only if you are willing to release control and surrender your life to Jesus. However, if nothing changes, nothing changes. See you next time. Hey, if you are still listening and you like this podcast, I want to encourage you to listen to previous episodes because they will help to inspire change in your life. Also, if you like what you hear, please leave a positive review because it helps to bring this podcast to others. But no matter what, may God bless you and may God bring positive change to your life.